Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam shri radhika prana nata pada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasya dattam tam shri gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payura Shomuda Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupari Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhuttanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surito Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Iha viharati Radha Krishna Kunjarikari Tarubhaya Rasarite Shuddha Siddhanta Dhari Sakala Sujana Geya Krishna Dasa Videya Padamakila Gunanam Kaviraja Kavinam Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Nahoido Morachita Jeva Nahi Bhuji Keva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna upajive priti janive raserariti shunile borohohit shriyatam shriyatam nityam gyatam gyatam mura chintyatam chintyatam bhakta Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana the Svabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Maha Sagar Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on this earth, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad, and Sanatana Gosvami Pad. By their grace, Sri Krishna Das Kaviraja Gosvami Pad has given us Sri Chaitanya-caritamrta. And again today, we'll continue our reading and discussion of the Sanatana Shiksha, Madhya Lila chapter 22, wherein we're coming to the end of the section on Sharanagati. So in our last reading, we concluded our discussion of the verse that lists 6 types of Sharanagati, and we looked at points from the Hari Bhakti Vilas, from the Bhakti Sandarbha, and the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which showed the overlap and distinction between the concepts of Atmani Vedana and Sharanagati, and also the overlap and distinction between friendship or Sakhya and Sharanagati. And we concluded with discussion of how of Sharanagati's, quote, Purvatva or Apurvatva, depending on which reading you take, that Sharanagati is fundamental to all other angas of bhakti, and that it is incomparable in its pervasion of the whole of the path of bhakti and all acts of bhakti. So, having discussed all of that, we come to a final statement that Srimad Mahaprabhu makes in this regard, and another verse from Srimad Bhagavatam that he cites to evidence it. So, I'm on the top of a fresh file that's dated for today, and starts from Payar 102. Okay. In the following payar, Sriman Mahaprabhu describes the result of taking shelter in Sri Krishna and fully offering the self to him. The tippani states the following, quote, he describes the result of fully offering the self to Sri Krishna. Sharana, he speaks this verse. Sharanalaya kore Krishne atma samarpan, Krishna tare kore tat kale atma sama. One takes shelter and fully offers the self to Krishna. And at that time, Krishna makes one equal to himself. So taking shelter, one offers the self, and when one does so, then Krishna makes that person equal to himself. So we'll now explore what is meant by this idea of, quote, atma sama, or being made equal to Krishna. We know that in general, bhaktas like to be considered servants of Bhagavan, that they foster the attitude that their relation between Bhagavan, or their sambandha with Bhagavan, is a sevya sevak sambandha. The relationship of servitor and object of service, or servitor and served. So to be said that for the servitor to hear that they are equal to the object of service, this doesn't mesh with their understanding of their relation, or it's not a compatible sense in general. So then we can understand that this sense of equality spoken of here wouldn't refer to an absolute sense of equation or a sense of a disintegration of distinction. So what sort of equality cum distinction, or what sort of equality in the context of a fundamental distinction is being alluded to here? That's what we'll discuss today. So, the limb of bhakti, known as fully offering the self, and as, quote, offering the self, atma samarpan or atma nivedan, is mentioned later in this chapter in verse 121, in the midst of the enumeration of the principal limbs of bhakti in the section on sadhana bhakti. Detailed discussion of this form of bhakti will be offered in the commentary on verse 121 that complements the discussion offered earlier in the commentary on verse 98 with respect to how offering the self is regarded as both a part of Sharanagati and as a limb of bhakti distinct from Sharanagati. So we're not going to go into a full analysis of this particular bhakti anga known as Atma Nivedan. We'll do that a little later when we go systematically through all of the 64 angas that Rupa Gosvami has mentioned in the Sindhu and that Sriman Mahaprabhu repeats here in these instructions to Sanatana Gosvami. What we're going to concern ourselves with is more the effect of that, or this, quote, Atma Samatva, or this equality with Bhagavan's self that is spoken of here. So the tippani states the following in regard to the present payar, quote, the result of that, verily, is equality of the self with Sri Krishna. So the payar, restates the meaning, the commentary restates the meaning of the payar, but it doesn't tell us what it means. So what is the specific nature of the equality with Sri Krishna that a Sharanagata who fully offers the self is here said to attain? As was discussed in the commentary on verse 75 of this chapter, although some of Sri Krishna's own qualities can be infused into the body of a Vaishnava can never attain equality with Sri Krishna in all respects. Thus, the equality spoken of here by Sriman Mahaprabhu can only be some partial form of equality. Insight into the specificity of this equality can be gleaned from the following verse, which Sriman Mahaprabhu cites to evidence his statement in the present payar. So we discussed earlier all these different qualities of Krishna and how some, but not all of them, become infused into his bhaktas. So the capacity to manifest and destroy universes or to, rule over Vaikuntha, these are not potencies or capabilities that he invests in his bhaktas. But to have certain admirable qualities or endearing traits that he has, those type of things are passed on. So we went through a systematic analysis of those things based on the Sindhu and the Priti Sandarbha earlier. So having already understood that thus far in this chapter, when it says that the Sharanagata becomes equal to Bhagavan, then we can say fundamentally we know this doesn't mean equality outright. So now we'll dive into the specificity of this equality. So he cites a statement from the 11th canto, spoken by Sri Krishna to Uddhava. Martyo yada tyakta samasta karma niveditatma vishikirshito me taramritatvam pratipadyamano mayatma bhuyaya cha kalpate vai. When a mortal becomes one who has relinquished all karmas and offered the self to me, then he becomes distinctly desirous to act, attains immortality, and verily becomes fit for becoming of self-same nature with me. So this, in the last line, you see this phrase, Mayatma bhuyaya cha kalpate vai. So you have maya, this is one word, and then that's compounded, not compounded, but brought together by sandhi with the word, with the compound atma bhuyaya. So atma bhuya here I've rendered it here as self-same nature, or so to speak, being of his self. So the Bhagavatam itself is using this, you could say, cryptic remark, saying when someone gives themselves to me, then they become fit for Atma Bhuya, or this state of being myself, or of being of my nature. So what does that refer to? Now we'll look at the commentaries on this verse to try to draw out what would be the intended sense. The statement in the previous payar that Krishna, quote, makes one equal to himself, refers to the statement in the verse under discussion that one, quote, becomes fit for becoming of self-same nature with me. Sri Samipad interprets this to refer to a bhakta attaining oneness with Krishna in the sense of the bhakta attaining Aishvarya equal to Krishna's. Sri Jivapad accordingly states that this phrase refers to the attainment of Sarshti Mukti, and clarifies that it refers to capability or Aishvarya equal to Krishna's only in a secondary sense, since it is impossible for jivas to attain certain capabilities of Krishna's, like emanating and sustaining universes, much less paramount capabilities of his, like rulership over Vaikuntha. So what does, quote, self-same nature mean? Sridhar Swami says, the bhakta attains the same Aishvarya as Bhagavan. So someone might say, whoa, that's a strong statement. To say that the bhakta has as much Aishvarya as Bhagavan, or as much godness as God does, aren't you essentially saying that he becomes God, or he is God? So Jiva Gosvami comes along and, gives some brackets to Sridhar Swami's statement and says, this doesn't refer quite to that, but to Sarshti Mukti, or in other words, the category of Mukti mentioned elsewhere in the Bhagavatam, where one attains some of the godliness of God, or some of the Aishvarya of the Supreme Ishvara, but not all of it. So that in a secondary sense. So we understand that the Parshads of Bhagavan and Vaikuntha, they also possess the ability to move about at will, to dwell in the midst of all sort of divine facilities and, divine forms of opulence, etc. So in that sense, but not that they literally become equal in godliness or Aishvarya to Bhagavan in every respect. So that's how Sridhar Swami and Jiva Gosvami have interpreted this equality. So now, is that the equality that's implied in this context here in the Caritamrta? Well, maybe not. Or in other words, let's analyze this further and see if it fits. But first, we'll look at Sanatana Gosvami's discussion. Sri Sanatana Pad also offers an alternate interpretation of the equality with Krishna said to be attained by a bhakta at the end of his colorful commentary on this verse. So, as we've said many times, Sanatana Gosvami repeatedly reiterates the commentaries of Sridhara Swami throughout his commentary on Hari Bhakti Vilas, but occasionally tweaks them or offers additional alternatives. So this is the additional alternative he gives after also accepting Sridhara Swami's view. So he comments as follows. He says, when a mortal becomes one who has relinquished all karmas, and one who has offered the self to me, then because of me he becomes distinctly desirous to act. That is, because of my bestowing prema bhakti and so forth upon him, he becomes of distinct desire to act. That is, his desire to act takes on a different nature and form of expression. Then, furthermore, he attains immortality, or amritatva, meaning existing beyond death as a result of the cessation of samsara. Or, meaning, so now he plays with the word amritatva. So one meaning of, mrita means dead. So amrita means not dead or undying. So amritatva means the state of being undying or immortality. So one sense is that the person acquires a new attunement of the psyche such that they now desire to act and subsequently act in a categorically unique way than they did before. And as a result of that, they become liberated, or they achieve immortality or liberation from samsara, or the cessation of their samsara comes about. This, you could say, is a more or less what you might expect, or a relatively conventional reading. So now he goes another direction with it, based on another sense, because the word amrita can also refer to that which causes amrita, or quote-unquote nectar, or this elixir, so to speak, the nectar of immortality, and more loosely, something highly relishable or nectarian in general. So going in that direction, he says, or, meaning he experiences the taste of the highest bliss. So amrita can be loosely taken as a synonym for rasa. And thus, to, quote, attain the state of amrita means to attain the taste of nectar, or to attain the experience of the ultimate bliss. So this is one interpretation. Now he gives a third. Alternately, he attains the state of being immersed in the nectar of my lips. There is a clear non-mention of this, that is of the final meaning, because of its being confidential, and the tva affix on the word amrita, used in the form of the word amritatvam, loosely, quote, nectarship, is stated with the intent of describing one's having entered a state of non-distinction from this nectar of my lips, because of one's being fully absorbed in, or alternately closely attached to that. That is, having it stuck on one's own lips as a result of incessant drinking of it. So we could take this in two ways. One, it could refer to the way that those who have dasya bhakti, or bhaktas in general, may partake of Krishna's remnants. We hear Uddhava with this well-known statement, Uchistir bhojino dasas tavamayam jaimahi, that we, your servitors, partaking of your remnants, we cross over Maya. So to relish the food that has been taken partially by Bhagavan, and thus to taste his saliva, so to speak, is comparable to this drinking a fine nectar or elixir, and to have even the nectar of his lips on one's own, so to speak. So it could be taken like this in a general way. And given that Krishna is making this statement to Uddhava, in the 29th chapter of the 11th canto, where more or less general topics of bhakti are being explained that aren't specific to Madhura Rasa, this might be more applicable, so to speak. But of course, in the context of Madhura Rasa, this could also be interpreted to mean, Adaramrita, as it's spoken of, to refer poetically to the act of kissing. And in the, quote, mukta pragraha nyaya, or the, taking the free rein meaning of these words out of context, the ultimate state of having offered the entirety of the self to Bhagavan is found only in Madhura Rasa, and thus this type of lip nectar drinking would refer to that. So this is another way it can be interpreted, or recontextualized, if you will. Additionally, he becomes fit or capable for becoming of self-same nature with me, that is, for ultimate union with me. Vai means verily. So again, you could take this notion of that Sanatana Gosvami raises of ultimate union to mean eternally being a part of Bhagavan's Leela and his eternal abode, or you could take it in perhaps a more narrow sense to refer to the union with Krishna that's found in Madhura Rasa. So, given that Sri Sanatana Pad takes this verse to refer to the attainment of a bhakta, upon whom Sri Krishna has bestowed prema bhakti, the ultimate union he speaks of here is to be understood to refer to union in the sense of having the privilege of directly participating in Sri Krishna's Leela, rendering service to him personally, and thereby relishing his sweetness in full. As wonderful, profoundly desirable, and apt as the attainment indicated by this interpretation of the verse under discussion may be, it is unlikely that this particular sense of ultimate equality between Krishna and the Jiva is the one being spoken of by Sriman Mahaprabhu in the previous payar. So, Jai to Sanatana Gosvami Pad for his colorful interpretation of this verse in this case. But if we can see how the verse is being quoted by Mahaprabhu, this payar that he's speaking in the previous verse, the context that he's speaking it here in the prakaran, he may not be referring ultimately to that, although he isn't necessarily not referring to that. Or in other words, you could interpret his statement to ultimately point to these things, but it's unlikely that he's referring specifically to that, because he's speaking now of Sharanagati right before he talks about sadhana bhakti. And as we've discussed in the previous class, Jiva Gosvami explains multiple places in the Bhakti Sandarbha that Sharanagati to Bhagavan precedes engagement in the various other limbs and acts of sadhana bhakti, like taking diksha from a guru and engaging in various types of kirtan or meditation or puja or what have you. So when Mahaprabhu is speaking about the bhakta giving themselves and being accepted by Bhagavan, contextually it would make more sense for this to be a much more general or initial sense of equality than this kind of, quote, ultimate union or this kind of ultimate level of attainment that can finally come about by going through this process in the most profound way that is possible to do so. So, further support for reading the intent of Mahaprabhu in this context more generally comes from another statement that he makes on the exact same subject, after or in regard to which he quotes this exact same verse from the Bhagavatam, later on in the Antya Lila. So, rather, it can be observed that later in the fourth chapter, that should be in chapter 4 of the Antya Lila, Sriman Mahaprabhu makes a statement that is nearly identical to the one he made to Sanatana Pad in the previous payar. Yet, in this second case, he speaks in more detail about the equality Sri Krishna bestows upon the Jiva who offers themselves to Sri Krishna, and cites the same verse from Srimad Bhagavatam that he does here as evidence of it. So because we have another case where the same exact verse is quoted after the same exact point, but but more detail is made, we can say that it's likely that what he's saying here is further clarified by what he says later on. So what he says later is as follows. Prabhu kohe Vaishnavera deha prakrita kabu noy, aprakrita deha bhaktera chiranandamoy. Diksha kale bhakta kore atma samarpan, se kale Krishna tare kore atma sam, se deha tare kohe chiranandamoy, aprakrita dehe tar charana bhajai. Prabhu said, a Vaishnava's body is never mundane. A bhakta's body is supramundane, constituted of consciousness and bliss. At the time of Diksha, a bhakta fully offers the self, and at that time, Krishna makes him equal to himself. Krishna makes that previously mundane body of the bhaktas to then be constituted of consciousness and bliss. Thus then, in his supramundane body, he worships the feet of Krishna. So, he's saying that the body of a Vaishnava is not mundane, it's supramundane. And why? Because when a person receives Diksha, they offer the self, then Krishna, at that time, quote, makes him equal to himself. And then, so this exactly the topic we're on now, this Atma Samatva that we're trying to understand. Here Mahaprabhu again speaks of that very same thing. And then he goes on to say, what is this equality? Or he further qualifies that equality by saying, Krishna makes that previously mundane body of his to then be constituted of consciousness and bliss. So the equality then is that as Krishna's body is made of consciousness and bliss and is not a material body, so too the bhakta's body is no longer material but becomes constituted of consciousness and bliss. In that sense, Krishna makes the bhakta equal to himself. In other words, he makes the bhakta have a Chidananda body like his own. The intended sense of equality between Sri Krishna and the dedicated jiva spoken of in the previous payar, and evidenced by the verse under discussion, is thus likely simply the equality of being constituted of consciousness and bliss. So, from further analysis of other contexts in the Caritamrta, we arrive at this viewpoint, and to support this viewpoint, we'll look at the commentary of Visvanatha Cakravarti on this verse from the Bhagavatam, because in his commentary, he takes it directly in this sense. So Sri Cakravarti comments elaborately on the verse under discussion from the same perspective as it is discussed in the aforecited passage from Sriman Mahaprabhu's latter statements to Sri Sanatan from the Antya Lila. So now we're going to look at quite an elaborate, and this isn't even the whole thing, but this is an excerpt from a very elaborate commentary that Cakravarti makes on a verse in the 5th canto, in which he happens to discuss this verse from the 11th canto at length, which is not all that common, that he goes into elaborate discussion of a verse elsewhere in Bhagavatam than the verse that he's commenting on. So, in any case, this is how he interprets it. So he cites the verse that we're talking about, and then he, within a commentary elsewhere in the 5th canto, and then he gives a commentary on this verse from the 11th canto, which goes like this. When a mortal becomes one by who all karmas have been relinquished. So now he glosses this tyakta samasta karma as, quote, one by who all desire for varnashram dharma has been relinquished at the time of receiving teaching from the Guru. So, as we've discussed earlier in regard to the subject of eligibility for the path of bhakti, to acquire shraddha in bhakti is to acquire conviction that by serving Bhagavan, all of one's responsibilities are fulfilled, and therefore one bears no further responsibility to uphold the duties of one's varna and ashrama. Hence, Krishna says at the end of the Gita, Sarva dharman parityaja mamekam sharanam braja, surrender to me, leaving all the duties of your varna and ashrama. So here he says, at the time of receiving teaching from Guru, in other words, when one learns about the path of bhakti and acquires shraddha in that through sadhu sangha, then one relinquishes all the karmas. Or in other words, one gives up one's interest in following the path of karma, in engaging only in varnashram dharma, and instead becomes one who wants to follow the path of bhakti. And now he gives a second level of interpretation by saying two, one, when the next phrase is niveditatma in the verse, or one by whom the self has been offered. So he interprets that as follows. One by who the self, the object of I-ness and the objects of my-ness, has been offered to me in the form of Sri Guru. So to offer the self, he's saying that the self refers to both that which we call or think of as I, and all that we consider my. So to give everything that is I and everything that is mine, that is to offer the self. So one by whom the self, the object of I-ness and the objects of my-ness, has been offered to me in the form of the blessed Guru, such that one becomes possessed of the determination, as described in the Padma Puran, quote, that which is called I, and whatever is considered by me to be mine here in this world and the next, all of that has been offered in full unto your venerable feet, O Master. So this is an illustration of the act of offering the self, which is what was mentioned in the pyar we quoted and what was mentioned in the pyar that we're analyzing. So in one way of summarizing, what does it mean to offer the self? It means to say that all that is mine and all that is I offer that to you. So when someone does these two things, in other words, when one extracts their sense of I and my from the path of karma and from the sense of being a performer of the path of karma who's duty-bound to follow it, and instead, by the teaching of the Guru, acquires a sense of I referent to the eternal self that's distinct from the body and the social role that one plays, and offers then that self as well as everything that's at one's disposal or one is regarded as one's own. When one is thus tyaktva samasta karma and niveditatma, then what happens? So the rest of the verse describes the effects. Then that person, although, quote, falsely, meaning non-eternally existent, so although that person who's doing that is not an eternal being, in other words, although the jivatma is eternal, the quote-unquote person doing this activity, this particular human body with this particular set of traits, etc., that is not eternal. So something that's non-eternal is in some cases called false or non-existent or falsely existent, in the sense that to be existent proper is to be eternally existent or ever existent. So to not be eternally existent can be described as quote-unquote mithya or falsely existent. So although falsely existent in that particular human appearance one presently bears, shall because of me become distinctly desirous to act. That is, possessed of distinct desire to act, meaning that person shall become free from the three gunas on account of bhakti to me. As per the statement in 11.25.26, quote, refuge in me is nirgun. So what binds us within the realm of karma? Our desires. Because we perform actions with attachment, because we perform actions with desire for things of the world, we accrue bondage within the plane of karma. So here this quote, vichikirshata, is it sounds a little bit funny in English, but it's what's called a desiderative form in Sanskrit, where it refers not to an actor or to a desirer, but to a combination of the two, one who's possessed of a particular desire to perform a particular activity. So they have a whole particular grammatical construct to refer not just to performers of actions, but those who desire to perform particular actions. So one who, quote, just desires to act in a general sense is called chikirsha. So vichikirsha, Chakravarti Pad is saying this prefix is on their V to indicate that now this person is desirous to act differently or distinctly. There's a unique way that they're now motivated. And because of that distinct motivation, in other words, because the grounds of that motivation is now Bhagavan, is now an object which is nirguna, they themselves become nirguna, or they themselves become go beyond the three gunas. So he extrapolates from this. He certainly is not transitory because of being an effect of Maya. He is real. So what he wants to say is that everything that's an effect or a product of Maya is transitory. Maya itself is eternal, the constituents of Maya are eternal, but the products that they produce are not eternal. They ebb and flow, they come and go. So you may say, well, any human being is just, a non-eternal product of Maya. So he's saying, although this person is not eternally existent, still don't think that they're just an effect of Maya. In other words, although they look like any other effect of Maya, don't think that. Think that this person is actually real, or that they are of eternal nature, even though they appear to be temporary just like anything else. And he adds to that, and he is also not falsely existent because of being an effect of ignorance. In other words, all these bodies that we assume, they're all a product of our desires, all these desires are a product of our ignorance. This is all just a big meaningless, bad movie, some sort of negative, view on the world like this, like a negating perspective taken by some of the Jnana-marg. He's saying, don't think that this Vaishnav, who's now possessed of the desire to serve Bhagavan, having given the self to Bhagavan and given up identification with everything mundane, don't think that this person is just another, false mirage produced by ignorance. So what should you think instead? Rather, he is inherently existent. Why? Because he as an embodied entity constituted of the Tatastha Shakti, now under the influence of my Sarup Shakti, is not merely a jiva whose state of embodiment is an effect of the Maya Shakti, or her principal effect, namely ignorance. In other words, this person has now come under the influence of Sarup Shakti. Bhagavan has now made them his own. Bhagavan's own Sarup Shakti is now to be considered the constituent element of their existence, not the Maya Shakti. Because of being an effect of me, or a product of me, now my Shakti is constituting them, even though they look the same to you. Therefore, he can only be nirguna. My Shakti is nirgun, therefore that bhakta is nirgun. So even though they look completely mundane and they get sick just like somebody completely mundane, and they feel pain like somebody who's completely mundane, don't think they're mundane. That's all happening in a way that resembles the mundane, but is constituted of Bhagavan's Sarup Shakti, not the Maya Shakti anymore. Moreover, on account of the usage of the son affix, that is, a desiderative conjugation in the word vichikirshitaha, meaning of distinct desire to act, and the non-employing of a conjugation that implies he shall become, because of me, possessed of distinct action, he, being thus nirguna to some extent, indeed even while beginning to act on the path of bhakti, shall gradually, as a practitioner of bhakti having ascended to the stages of nishta, ruchi, asakti, and rati, become completely nirguna. Then his relation with falsely existent objects shall not occur, but prior to that, his relation with them as appropriate is observable. So this is really a fine point that Chakravarti Pad is bringing out here. Essentially, he's deriving this by saying, why did the desiderative conjugation get used in this verse? Why couldn't you just use the more conventional conjugation of someone who's now performing distinct action? The person gave up all karma. They surrendered themselves to Bhagavan. So now they're doing bhakti, they're not doing karma. So you could have just called them someone who's performing a distinct type of action. But Krishna doesn't say that they're performing a distinct type of action. He's saying that they are desirous of performing a distinct type of action. They might not even be doing it yet. So from that, Chakravarti Pad is deriving this idea that even someone who hasn't even really done bhakti yet, but is just planning to, who just wants to, but hasn't even truly succeeded in doing so, even that person should still be regarded as completely nirgun. Even if they're not in the higher advanced stages of nishta and ruchi, in other words, even if they have anarthas, even if they're only in the beginning stage, still you can think that that bhakta, that Vaishnava has a super mundane body. Still you can think that that Bhagavan's Sarup Shakti is now the constitution of this entity. And that yet, that might not be complete. So what he's implying then is that you have, guess what? A blend, a mixture of energies, right? Because he says that his relation, he's saying, while beginning to act on the path, shall gradually, having ascended to these stages, become completely nirguna. So to say that gradually he becomes completely nirguna implies that earlier on he's only partially nirguna. So you have essentially a blending of these two things simultaneously. So although we heard earlier on in this chapter that wherever Krishna is present, Maya cannot be present, Krishna surja sama Maya hoyandakar, just as light is present, darkness cannot exist. Well, it's not quite that simple. Here you go, we've got light and dark blended together. We've got Sarup Shakti and Maya Shakti coexisting in the same spot. So no, Chakravarti Pad is not confused. It's not that he doesn't know these general principles. Rather, he's drawing out a subtlety, which is important to understand, that although we have these loose ideas, like light comes and darkness goes, or, what's the first verse in the Bhagavatam? Dhamna svena sada nirastakuhakam. That this supreme entity, by his own light or his own power, then, the illusory is, forever dispelled. Okay, but he's essentially zooming in on that and saying, but if you play that in slow motion, it's actually happening in a state of gradual dispelling. It's not just necessarily disappearing in a flash when you flick on a light. So what we can derive from this is a way to understand how even a beginning Vaishnava who might not, so to speak, appear like anything special, can still be conceived as having a spiritual body, and that body still being physically visible, and still also appearing to be as though conventional. So he elaborates on his own explanation as follows. The meaning is this. Right at the time of his receiving instruction and in bhakti, in other words, he hasn't even done bhakti yet, he's just heard about bhakti. By my inconceivable Shakti, a body, senses, and mind that are beyond the gunas are manifested for him by me invisibly. That is, I grant him a body, senses, and mind that appear identical to his previous mundane body, senses, and mind, for the purpose of showing the greatness of bhakti. The unreal forms of these, that is, the bhakta's previous body, senses, and mind, become dissolved completely invisibly. That is, without any difference between the new and the old body, senses, and mind being observable to anyone. So essentially he's saying that just when you get taught bhakti, your whole body, mind, and senses become reconstituted out of Bhagavan's own Sarup Shakti without you or anyone else even feeling or seeing the difference. So now he gives an example. As described in the Bhagavad 3.135, quote, this type of might, as was shown by Maharaj Priyavrata, is not surprising for persons who have conquered the 6 senses by virtue of the dust of the feet of Arukrama, since even one who has come from afar, that is even someone of the lowest caste, this is how the commentators take it, immediately gives up the body just after having pronounced his name only once. In other words, once pronounce Bhagavan's name and one's body is reconstituted, is how he's interpreting this. The meaning is this: this type of might, like that of creating the 7 oceans, as performed by Priyavrata, is not surprising. Indeed, what is surprising is this: even one who has come from afar, that is someone of the lowest caste, who has even once pronounced the name of Urukrama, immediately, that is right at that moment, gives up the body, meaning that then even though his body remains visible, abandonment of the body he had possessed of prarabdha karma occurs entirely invisibly. That is, by means of Bhagavan's inconceivable Shakti, his material body ceases to exist imperceptibly, and he dawns and appears in a nirgun body granted to him by Bhagavan. Furthermore, he then attains immortality, that is, the absence of the attribute of death, and becomes fit for becoming of self-same nature with me, that is, for attaining my own state, the standing of myself, meaning, where I dwell, there specifically he too then dwells for the sake of my service. So this Vaishnava gets a spiritual body, they attain immortality, and they can enter into Bhagavan's abode where they can render service to Bhagavan. But, the implication is sequentially, or these things happen in stages. In this way, furthermore, objects in this world that are considered falsely existent. So now, if that wasn't enough for you, now he goes even beyond this. So, objects in this world that are considered falsely existent, meaning, fruits and flowers and leaves and all sorts of other perishable things, as a result of their contact with bhakti, their state of being falsely existent is removed, and immediately their state of being absolutely real is manifested by Bhagavan, in accord with the wish of his bhakta, who is employing those objects such as foods, flowers, and his own body in the service of Bhagavan. What cannot be accomplished by Bhagavan by means of his inconceivable Shakti? Nothing. In other words, this bhakta's body can be conceived as made of Sarup Shakti, and then even whatever stuff he starts touching in the world, that also starts transforming into spiritual things that Bhagavan can accept. Because Bhagavan is accepting the offerings of his bhakta. But Bhagavan doesn't accept material things. Therefore, those things are becoming transformed in their constitution because of the wish of the bhakta that Bhagavan have them. So how is this possible? He refers to statements of Bhagavan himself, such as, quote, Shraddha in service to me, however, is nirguna, and an abode of myself, however, is nirguna, are rightly stated. So, the faith, the conviction that someone has, the place where the deity of Bhagavan exists, all of these things can be conceived to be beyond the gunas. So you might say, well, how is this possible, and how can I understand that this is happening? So to that, he just caps it off by saying, the statement in the Udyama Parva of Mahabharata, quote, do not assess inconceivable states of being with argumentation. That which is beyond the material elements is the characteristic of the inconceivable, is cited by the commentator, namely Sri Caitanya-caritamrta, in regard to such matters as well. In other words, don't analyze it too much. You're not necessarily going to understand. It actually may not ever tangibly be perceived differently. In other words, in one sense, this is just a philosophical overlay upon what will otherwise look the same. But it's, you could say theologically necessary to understand that this process unfolds in order for all the dynamics and the whole Shakti format to play out all of its implications. So how does this relate specifically to our topic of discussion? Sri Chakravarti Pad's view, in gist, is that from the time of one's beginning to receive instruction about the path of bhakti, one who fully offers the self to Krishna in his externally visible manifestation as the blessed Guru, begins to become nirguna, that is, constituted of consciousness and bliss rather than matter, and gradually becomes more and more so as bhakti becomes progressively further manifest in the psyche, until it reaches the state of manifestation known as rati, and then renders its host nirguna in totality. Sri Chakravarti Pad elsewhere also comments more concisely on the verse under discussion and adds some additional significant points. So this is where he comments actually on this particular verse in the 11th canto. So it's somewhat a repetition, but he adds a few more details, which we'll notice as we go, and then that will conclude our discussion. So, when a human being, that is one by who all compulsory, incidental, and elective activities have been relinquished by virtue of the clarity produced by the independent grace of my bhakta. In other words, when and how does someone give up the path of karma? When they get the grace of a bhakta. And whose self is offered unto the Guru, the teacher of my mantra, who is a manifest form of myself, that is, by whom the object of I-ness and the objects of my-ness have been offered in full by mind and by speech, in the manner described in this verse from Padma Puran. Quote, that which is called I and whatever is considered to be mine, here in this world and the next, all of that has been offered in full unto your venerable feet, O Master. Then, starting right from that moment, that mortal shall become, because of me, become of distinct desire to act. That is, because of a semblance of bhakti to me, given by me, he shall become possessed of desire to act that is distinctive from even yogis, jnanis, and others. So Bhagavan himself is giving this semblance of bhakti, whereby the person can then do bhakti back to him. So he's qualifying this as a semblance. In other words, immediately bhakti is not given in full, but some semblance of bhakti is given, and then by the purifying effect of that semblance, one reaches the state of becoming imbued with bhakti in full. Thereby, my bhakta, being not merely an apparently real existent effect of maya, and also not merely a falsely existent effect of ignorance, but verily an effect, you can read effect as product here, of me beyond the gunas, attains immortality. That is, the state of being possessed of the absence of death, meaning destruction, and becomes fit for becoming of self-same nature with me specifically. That is, for my attaining my own fortune. That is, for attaining capability and so forth like mine. On account of the word cha, this result is an unsought result, unlike being an associate of mine possessed of prema. So this is a nice final point, right? Because becoming an associate of me possessed of prema is the primary aim and attainment of my bhakta. So by saying that he's taking this cha on there to say, and he becomes atma bhuya, and he becomes of equal nature to me. Meaning, that's not what he was really seeking. What he wanted to be was my companion who had prema for me, who always renders service to me, and coincidentally or tangentially, he also attains a nature like mine, he also exists in my abode, etc. But that the real aim of the bhakta is to become a parshad of Bhagavan, and to have prema for him, and express that prema in the form of being and serving as one of Bhagavan's companions. So, in summary and essence, in light of the points made in the aforesaid commentaries, when Sriman Mahaprabhu says in the previous payar, quote, one takes shelter and fully offers the self to Krishna, and at that time Krishna makes one equal to himself, he means that he imbues such a bhakta with a manifestation of his Sarup Shakti that initiates the process by which the bhakta's psyche, body, paraphernalia, and so forth are transformed from saguna to nirguna, from being constituted of prakriti to being constituted of consciousness and bliss, and in this way makes such a bhakta, quote, equal to himself. So that's what we have on this topic, and that concludes the section on Sharanagati. So with the, you could say, the Shruti fall or the Mahatma, what is the benefit of all this talk of Sharanagati that we've had for all these, the last 10 plus verses, the recent set of classes? The ultimate benefit is that you can become, intimately related to or accepted as quote-unquote equal to Bhagavan. You can acquire a divine nature whereby you can have eternal, pure exchanges of prema with him. So Sharanagati is the prerequisite for that, or the fundamental to take up the path that leads to that attainment. So now, having explained all of that, from here on, Mahaprabhu explains now the process of sadhana bhakti, or for those who acquire Shraddha, who want to leave the path of karma, to take up the path of bhakti and engage themselves in the path of bhakti such that they can be purified and blessed to receive this full manifestation of Shri Rupa Sakti we call Bhava and Prema Bhakti. Then there is the path of sadhana. So from our next class, we'll dive into a new prakaran and we'll look at a very, very important verse, a very, very important topic, the definition of sadhana bhakti. And from there, then we'll go into an extended discussion of the various specific limbs or practices that are part of sadhana bhakti. And before that, we'll also introduce the distinction between the two primary modes of sadhana bhakti, known as Vaidhi bhakti and Raganuga bhakti. First, there'll be an analysis of Vaidhi bhakti, then an analysis of all the different practices, and then finally, an explanation of Raganuga bhakti and how those practices that were mentioned earlier are also applicable on the path of Raganuga bhakti. So that's where our conversation goes for the rest of the chapter. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any other type, please feel free.
Pranam Babaji.
Pranam.
Yes, it's about the body of the sadhaka.
Okay.
Once he have taken shelter in the diksha,
yeah,
it is said you say that actually his body is considered as sat, kind of eternal. But at the moment of the death, the sadhaka, or the bhakta, he has to leave this body, and he cannot enter in the spiritual realm with the same body.
Right.
So how can we understand that?
So the distinction here, it's sort of a twist, if you will, on the categorization, in that one way something is understood to be eternal or sat is that it exists in its perceptible form forever. Another way of understanding it is that it's constituted of elements that are made up of consciousness and bliss. In other words, if you notice here, right, it's saying that in the verse itself and in the payar I cited from the Antya Lila, that the bhakta becomes chidanandamoy. So interestingly, it doesn't say Sat Chidanandamoy, right? It just says Chidanandamoy. And Chakravarti Pad, let me see if I can find it here. This is a bit of a long passage, but he also uses the phrase, let me just see if I can fish it out. I'd have to read through the whole thing. I don't want to take your time too long. But he makes a similar type of remark in this comment from the Bhagavatam. So, and he also says that the bhakta becomes, quote, deathless, or the verse itself saying amritatva. So, yes, the bhakta still dies, but what we can say is that they nevertheless are said to become immortal in the sense that they've acquired prior to death a constitution that is of the nature of the immortal world. In other words, Bhagavan Sarup Shakti, the chit, the ananda of that quality or caliber is now present in them, and they remain in connection with that even across the threshold or the removal of previous memory that's called death. So in that sense, they become deathless, or they acquire a certain continuity of being that is distinct from the break in continuity that conditioned beings experience through the process of death. So, you might, Chakravarti Pad is a little bold here. He's trying to, draw out all these implications, and he's wanting to argue that we shouldn't think of bhaktas and regard bhaktas as merely equivalent to those who are not bhaktas. That, in other words, he's trying to instantiate the significance of being blessed by a Vaishnava, of being blessed by a guru, of being blessed by Bhagavan, of having Shraddha in Bhagavan, in devoting oneself to the path of bhakti, that this actually results in a change in the constitution of one's being, albeit imperceptibly initially. And so from those perspectives, there's a certain immortality attained, or a certain deathlessness, or a certain state of being of the nature of consciousness and bliss, even if for a bhakta at earlier stages that's not directly perceptible. So one way we could also take it is that, as Rupa Gosvami speaks about in the Sindhu, the samskaras, or the vasana for bhakti that we culture in this life, stays with us in the next life and motivates us in the next life to go further on the path of bhakti. So in that sense, there's also a continuity for persons who might not have reached perfection in this lifetime, whereby that presence and that constituting element of the Chid and the Ananda of Bhagavan's Sarup Shakti is still there with that fortunate jiva. So he's kind of, loosening a little bit certain categories to make these points. But it's in keeping, if we just take it in a simple sense of the payar that we're talking about, that, by taking shelter in Bhagavan, by giving yourself to Bhagavan, Bhagavan makes you equal to him. So, not completely, not, in a way that is maybe so easily perceptible to others, but substantially in a way that will lead to this ultimate state of intimacy between the two. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, so maybe it is that what you call a blend of the two nature, the material and the spiritual nature, because what I can understand is that finally the Siddha Swarupa that one day we will reach is already present with the material body that the sadhaka still have. Maybe I'm wrong.
That particular point isn't what's made here. In other words, this is talking about what you might call a spiritualization of the sadhaka deha, or of the yatha stita deha, the body as is presently situated. So what you call the siddha deha, as described by the attainment of Dhruva or Narada in the Bhagavatam, that is said to be something that's that's bestowed at the time of death for someone who's reached the standard of bhava bhakti or prem bhakti. So that itself is not what's said to be attained here at this initial point of offering of the self. But no doubt one is now in the track or the path towards the attainment of that. Since, in other words, the body here that becomes accepted by Bhagavan, this body is not the body that one is going to have when one is there. One is going to there have a body that's suitable to that plane of one's attainment. Whether the Vaishnava goes to Vaikuntha or Vraja or what have you, they're not going to go in this 21st century human body from continent A or continent B, right? They're going to have a body that's suited to those particular abodes and all of Bhagavan's preferences there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Babaji.
Sure. Yes, another hand.
Pranam, Shri Krishna Shri Dasa. So I had a question, I guess. I know we only spent a short amount of time on it, so I hope it's okay, but I had a question on Sri Swamipad's interpretation of the Bhagavatam verse 11:29-34.
Okay.
So he had an interpretation in terms of Aishvarya, and I think, if I remember correctly, we saw that there was an upper limit on that Aishvarya, that, Bhagavan has the supreme Aishvarya of rulership, of lordship over Vaikuntha, as well as the ability to create and destroy and maintain worlds and so forth, and that the fully accomplished Bhakta attains, according to Swamipad, the fully accomplished Bhakta attains some Aishvarya, but not that much Aishvarya, some less. And I wanted to ask if we could possibly put a lower limit on the Aishvarya too. So, like in some other spiritual paths other than Bhakti, like the yoga of Patanjali, or last week I was reading about the yoga of the Nath Sampradaya, kind of randomly, maybe without much good reason, but anyway. But some of these kinds of yoga, they also claim that they're fully accomplished practitioners attain some powers and stuff. Could we say that according to Swamipad, the powers or Aishvarya attained by a fully accomplished bhakta is at least as much as that attained by like the Raja Yogi or the Hatha Yogi? So it's somewhere in between. Would that be fair or not really?
Yeah, I think you could say that. In the book Samrita Sindhu, there's some analysis of the Krishna's qualities. 64 are enumerated, and there Rupa Gosvami specifies that I think is it 50 of them are attainable or perceptible in a minute form in various jivas within the world. And that some are only found in devatas, and then others are only found in self-same Vishnu manifestations. And we looked earlier when we talked about all the qualities that can appear in a Vaishnava, in the earlier part of this chapter, from the analysis in the Priti Sandarbha, of which of those qualities of Bhagavan can appear there and not. So if you took the list of those that can appear, it's a pretty big list. And it's definitely something pretty powerful and wonderful that, it wouldn't be attained even by a yogi who achieves, various types of siddhis or things like that. It would definitely have certain qualities that exceed all of that. I mean, even just the basic idea that you attain an eternal body and an eternal state of being, without that, any yogi or other person, short of moksha, nothing they attain is ever eternal or constituted of spirit in nature. So it's definitely categorically superior to what could be achieved by those other paths, according to our, viewpoint on things.
And then I had a more general question, I guess, because we saw just kind of a more general kind of hermeneutical question or methodological question is that, like today, for instance, we saw, many Swamipad through, Jiva Gosvami, Sanatana Gosvami, Sri Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur, and maybe some others, they each have their own interpretation. And I think we concluded, or you presented some arguments that Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur's, was the most relevant or the interpretation we should follow, for our own practice.
Well, I was saying in the context of the citation of this verse, in this context, this line of thought is the most applicable.
Okay.
In other words, because when you're reading the Caritamrta, whenever these verses are being quoted, they're being quoted as evidence for a point that's being made. So, the verse itself, in its own context, may have a wide range of meaning, but the reason it's being quoted in this context in the book we're reading might not refer to that full range of meaning. It might refer to a particular meaning within the range of meaning that it has.
I see. I didn't even think about that. Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Okay. That's a good point. So I guess I'll keep my question simple. So I know we're discussing the Caitanya-caritamrta in this class, but I guess one day, I mean, I don't even know any Sanskrit yet, so there's no way that I could really seriously engage with the commentators on the Bhagavatam. But just pretend that 10 years from now, I maybe have learned Sanskrit and I'm able to read, Swami Pad, and say I'm just reading the Bhagavatam and I'm reading Swami Pad and, Jiva Gosvami and other commentators and Visvanatha Cakravarti Thakur and any other commentators. What is there a certain hermeneutical approach you'd recommend if the commentators either disagree with each other, or maybe they don't really disagree with each other, they just have different emphases, is there a certain hermeneutical approach you'd recommend for kind of dealing with disagreements or different emphases among the commentators? If we pretend we're just reading the Bhagavatam and we're not doing this kind of intertextuality, which I know adds a whole nother layer of complexity, which I don't think I'm ready to even begin to really try to analyze, but...
I mean, the most common thing you'll see from the Gaudiya Vaishnava perspective, we have Samipad's commentary, we have Jiva Goswami's Krama Sandarbha, and we have Visvanatha Cakravarti's Sarita Darshini. These are the three main text commentaries that we read. And for the 10th canto, then we have the two Vaishnava Toshinis of Sanatana Gosvami and Jiva Goswami as well. For the most part, this is the main source for our Bhagavatam commentarial tradition. So, in the vast majority of cases, you'll see that Visvanatha Cakravarti directly derives his commentary from Sridhara Swami's commentary, and then usually goes further with it or gives some clever, colorful, interesting relish of it or adds another alternative. And that more commonly, Jiva Goswami will present some viewpoints of his own. But in many cases, he'll also no doubt not that he doesn't draw from Sridhara Swami, he draws profusely from Sridhara Swami and is influenced deeply by Sridhara Swami. But we can understand that the Krama Sandarbha was written by Jiva Goswami after the Shat Sandarbha. So he's writing the Shat Sandarbha to establish the theological system that he sees fit to essentially give a theological grounds for the works of Rupa and Sanatan. So then he's analyzing the Bhagavatam, and he's drawing from the Bhagavatam to establish everything he wants to do for his theological system. So he, in one sense, he has an agenda, or he has a purpose for the way that he's talking about certain verses. So then after doing all of this, he's writing the Krama Sandarbha, and then a lot of what you see in the Krama Sandarbha is basically a reordering of content from the Shat Sandarbha. But in some cases, with some interesting additions and edits. So, in some cases, the way Jiva Goswami goes with things is different than the way Sridhara Swami and then Cakravarti Pad elaborating on him go with it, because he's using a particular verse to instantiate a particular principle or lead to a particular conclusion that he wants to bring out in the context of his treatise. Whereas Samipad and Cakravarti Pad are more commenting on the Bhagavatam in situ, as it pertains to its context, as it pertains to the flow of the verses. And not that Jiva Goswami is not doing that, often he is, but in some cases he's also talking about things in another way or for other purposes. So that's one of the reasons that you can see differences in the way that the interpretations are given. Another reason can simply be that the verse itself is equivocal and can have multiple, in other words, it might be a verse that's not all that explicitly clear what it says. And so there's room for seeing it in different ways or of relishing it in different manners. And so if Jiva Goswami went one way with it, Cakravarti Pad might, find it complementary to add another further way of appreciating the point, which is not, so to speak, going against him or not following him or whatever, but, elaborating and deepening our appreciation for the text and of the relevant principles to the subject that's being described.
Okay.
So
Okay.
those are a couple factors involved.
So would it be, and I'm conscious of the time here. I don't want to make anyone stay too late, but I guess I'll try to keep it brief. But I just to make sure I'm understanding. So of the three commentators in the Bhagavatam, you mentioned Sridhara Swami, Jiva Gosvami, and Chakravarti Pad. All three we should take as authoritative, and everything they say is true. But we just have to see it in relation to other concepts in an appropriate way to the aim of the commentator himself. So we should accept everything is true, we just have to see it in the right light, in their own system, in their own context. Would that be generally true? Like we can't, we as, if we're following the Gaudiya Sampradaya, we should never ever think that anything one of these three commentators wrote was straight out false. It's true, but we just have to make sure we're seeing it from the right perspective when we say that it's true. Would that be, or?
Well, I'll go out on a limb here and say that as a follower of the Gaudiya Sampradaya, what you want to accept as true is up to you. In other words, we follow this Sampradaya, so whatever this Acharya says is perfect and that's it. Like, to me, truly being a follower of a Sampradaya doesn't mean just, okay, whatever the party says, that's what I believe. Okay, I must be dumb and I'll just follow what they said. Like, Chakravarti Pad was not just like, okay, whatever Jiva Goswami said is fine, cool. Like he's thinking deeply, analytically, critically, profoundly, poetically. He's drawing out like every human faculty and state of blessedness that you can have to bring out these highly relishable, profound insights, whether it's theological or in terms of rasa or what have you. And, Baladev Vidyabhushan, he also commented on the 10th canto. I didn't mention him. He also comes with his own viewpoints in some cases. And so, in my personal opinion, being a follower of the Sampradaya means not just blindly following what the Acharya said, but reading even what the Acharya said critically. Sorry, I don't mean critically in the sense of negatively or, in a disbelieving way, but with the term mimamsa is sometimes interpreted to mean pujaniya vichar, or that these things are deliberated upon, understanding them to be worthy of great honor. In other words, we take what they say extremely seriously. We really care about what they say. We really endeavor to appreciate what they say. We don't commit the folly of just, this is what somebody said and I think this. In other words, we spend years and years of our life carefully looking at all of these things, and we consider that there's value and meaning to do that. But I dare to say that that doesn't mean we just blindly follow any of it. But that if and to the extent that that genuinely satisfies our conscience, to the extent that our psyche has been purified, to that extent, we may resolve or regard this as a truth, so to speak, that we follow. Although, personally, the whole idea of truth is ultimately, philosophically debatable in the first place, and that there is no such thing as any quote-unquote universal or absolutely agreed upon truth in spiritual or material reality. And that ultimately it's about reaching a state of something that's aesthetically and to the attunement of one's own psyche profoundly satisfying, such that it evokes an ever fresh, enriching and endearing and valuable expression of love. And so if we find these works to be effective to that end, then they've done their job, or then they've lived on another generation as being of spiritual value to society. And the tradition might still be alive and not have just turned into a dry bunch of sheep who just say, okay, whatever he said, we'll repeat it. To me, that was never what the Goswamis wanted anyone to do in the first place. And basically every religion turns into that once it acquires a certain state of political power or even just cultural power, and then the people in the positions of power just and turn everybody into, okay, otherwise I'll get ostracized, or otherwise I go to hell, so now, all of this. So, I don't mean to be, here too iconoclastic or whatever, but personally, if you look at how the Sarvasang Vadini is written, Jiva Gosvami is never going like, now follow this because you have to. Like, now obey my commentary because I'm a Nitya Parshad. like, he never said anything like that. You know what I mean? He wanted that these things would be presented in such a refined and satisfying way that people would value them, that people would cherish them because of their merit, not because of a religious narrative that makes people think that they have to believe or that they just follow because this is how, quote, we do it. In other words, I've decided to be a follower of this group, so now I just ask, what's the party line? Okay, and now I just think along the line. You know, to be a relisher of rasa is not that. It never has been and it never will be. You know, but it's something that is an actual, you know, exercise of the full freedom and the full capacity and force of the heart and the mind. And, you know, in the course of reaching that state, no doubt, we will profoundly respect and we will deeply defer to these authorities, and will do very well to do so, you know. But personally, I don't believe, and I don't think it was ever the intent, that it's to be something that, you know, quote unquote, this acharya is to be followed. In other words, these are all things that have grown up over the course of the centuries as a kind of meta-narrative about what the so-called orthodoxy of the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya is. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm more or less just a complete mainstream follower of the traditional orthodoxy. Rup Sanatan, Jiva Gosvami, Kaviraja Gosvami, Vishnava, this is sort of as close to like a mainstream orthodoxy as there is. And I'm a happy little swimmer in the mainstream. I'm not off there on this or that or whatever. But I personally feel that, you know, as such, you don't need to be a sheep as you do so, and you're not meant to be, but that this is actually, you know, something that was written for people who would think freely and deeply about the subject matter and appreciate it for its own inherent value and regard it as like a truth in that sense, as opposed to just an orthodoxy that they accept and repeat.
May I add something?
Let me just see if he wants.
One of the best ways, one of the best ways to, I think I see what you're saying, that if one engages as a sheep, it may still be possible to engage as a sheep and attain the goal, but it's so much more relishable to really engage the entirety of one's psyche, including the critical intellect. Sorry about my camera, I don't know what it's doing. Anyway, my camera, my firmware for my camera is all crazy, but that engaging the entirety of the psyche, including the critical intellect and critical analysis, just is so much. It allows the speech and the spiritual essence of the acaryas to pervade our entire psyche in a more complete way, I guess. I don't know. I think I'm following this. It's part of what you're saying, at least.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, fundamentally, I'm just trying to say that to really love, you can't just be coerced into it by following an orthodoxy, but it has to be an actual expression of all your faculties as they're guided and blessed by these divine sources, as per the shraddha that an individual has.
Nice. This is a wonderful discussion.
May I add something?
Yes, all right. I've got a friend here who wants to add something. Yes?
This is Daoji. I just say that when you get to read Ujjvala Nilamani with the commentaries of Jiva Gosvami and Visvanatha Cakravarti, Visvanatha Cakravarti very often, bluntly disagrees with Jiva Goswami's interpretation of many shlokas in the Ujjvala Nilamani. However, no one feels obliged or moved to take either Jiva Gosvami or Visvanatha Cakravarti's side, because Jiva Gosvami his commentaries were more like on the. He took the position of Svakiya, and Visvanatha Cakravarti is taking the position of Parakiya, and both have room for both exist, but they're like different moods, like this. So that's what I wanted to say. Disagreement is obviously there, but it's not a disagreement on.
Yeah, there isn't one way of relishing anything, right? There's a plurality of ways of appreciating things, and we don't always have to reduce everything to a singularity.
I would like to add some thought of mine. What about if the Guru give the tools to discuss and to counteract some of his statements?
Sorry, if counteract which statements?
I mean, when the Guru is saying something, in the course of the study, the Guru can give the tools for disagreeing with what he said. So in this case, what can be said? For example, in the Nyaya, sometimes we have some declaration that does not seems to fit really with the logic. What can be said in this moment? Because we are not supposed to discuss what the Guru said.
Sorry, I'm not quite clear what you're asking.
Okay, so sometimes we have the capacity, because we are studying the philosophy, we have the capacity to object to some statement of the Guru. So can we use this capacity to object, or should we remain silent?
And are you talking about studying Nyaya, or are you talking about studying Bhakti?
I mean, yes, for Bhakti is something very clear and sure, but Nyaya may be interpreted in different manner. I'm talking about the objection we can do to the Guru when studying kind of philosophy like Nyaya, by example.
Or I was thinking, Vrajananda Dasa, perhaps do you mean that when one's studying Bhakti, one can use one's knowledge of Nyaya to make an argument that has a conclusion opposite of what the Guru is saying? Was my understanding correct?
Yes, when we are studying Bhakti with the help of different darshana like Sankhya or any other, because Bhakti is encompassing also all those darshana. So what I mean is that sometimes we cannot agree totally with what the Guru said, but should we use actually what we learn from the Guru to object, or should we just take as granted everything that he said about a certain topic?
I think that depends on the necessity felt within oneself. In other words, we hear in the Gita that to have doubts is detrimental to our practice. So if we feel doubts or if things don't seem appropriate, then it's our responsibility to seek clarification for those. So we don't use our knowledge to fabricate arguments for no reason, or argument for the sake of argument, or anything like that. But if in the course of sincerely trying to understand what is the intent or the tatparya of the text, if there is a discussion or a conclusion that's presented that seems to be incongruent according to one's understanding, then it's the responsibility of a student to seek clarification on that. But not, so, they might refer to a line of reasoning if that's the reasoning in their mind that's leading to the appearance of the incongruence, but they're not going to just argue for the sake of arguing, or argue about what is not meant to be argued about. But if there's a matter that pertains to such matters, and there's a feeling of genuine necessity for that, and it's a matter of importance, then there's the opportunity to respectfully raise one's query.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. It's 5 o'clock.
And Daoji, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm very much here. I'm so happy that Krishna Sharan has come to the UK and is giving here
Okay.
classes. And
Haribol. We need to sign off here. Anything else before we go?
Oh, okay. Yes. I'm glad I get a chance to talk with you, a few exchanges, Daoji. And I'm very grateful for your editing Jagadananda's translation. But I know this class is being recorded and posted on YouTube, so I don't want to interfere with Krishna Dasa's recording here. So sorry. But thank you, Daoji, for editing the Manjari Swarupa Nirupana.
Okay, send me your number.
Oh, okay. Hang on, I'll put it in the chat.
All right, go for it. Otherwise, we'll sign off here. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.